can't pick favorites. However, in my plant collection, currently my favorite plant is this variegated Rhaphidaphora tetrasperma. Its care is similar to an unvariegated Rhaphidaphora tetrasperma. However, the variegation does need a little bit extra, or else you'll lose leaves like this. So let's go through the care and start off with the fertilizing. Fertilizing is the easiest part of the care for this plant just because it's not picky about the type, so I usually just go in with my favorite and following the instructions on the bottle. I'll usually fertilize about once a month. It's really important to be consistent with the fertilizer since those variegated leaves don't provide energy for the plant. And because of that, these leaves right here are super variegated and they are just taking a toll on the plant. So to help out the plant, I am going to propagate it. I love me a good propagation, and in this instance, it's really important to propagate properly. This goes for all variegated plants, but if you cut the propagation at a node that doesn't have any variegation in it, you'll just revert the plant. And if you do the opposite, where you cut it and it has too much variegation, you'll be stuck in the scenario that I'm currently in and have to propagate it again because the plant will not get the nutrients it needs from the sun. So to determine where to propagate, I will look at the stem around the node. If it's not very well balanced between variegation and green, I will avoid it. I will avoid anything that is completely green or even completely variegated. Besides variegation, I like to also make sure that I have two nodes on the cutting. That way, in case one of them rots, I'll have a backup node that I can propagate from. This cutting looks a little funky because it's a propagation right under where I had previously propagated. However, it will be fine as it does have multiple nodes. To propagate it, it does take quite some time, but I find water propagation is my go-to as it is the fastest. However, you can propagate it in pretty much any propagating medium. But with that, let's move on to the soil needs. Before I start with the soil needs, I do want to point out that this plant does do well in all types of growing media. I've had it in leca, stratum, all of that. It does really well. However, I prefer soil because it grows the fastest in soil. I believe that soil depends on both the plant and the gardener, but for me, I like a soil that is a mix of soil and peat moss, so that way it is light and airy, and I also like to add chunks in it. So I've got coconut husk, I've also got some orchid bark, and a ton of perlite. That's what the plant likes. However, I adjust the soil based off of what I need, and I tend to water a lot less, so I like to add that garden soil in just so that it retains more moisture. But if you do tend to overwater, I would avoid something that is water retaining. The one thing I did notice about this plant is that its roots are starting to get a little exposed, so I'm just going to take some soil and add it into the top. After smoothing it out, the plant is now ready to be watered, so let's go into the watering care. One misconception about this plant is that because it's a tropical plant, it needs consistently moist soil, and I have found that to not be true. I find that it will rot very easily. So I tend to water it only when I find that the soil is pretty dry at the top couple of inches, and I water it about once every 1 to 2 weeks. How often really depends on the lighting, which we'll talk about next. This plant tolerates a wide range of sun. Right now, it is currently in direct south-facing sun, and it can tolerate that, but I've also got these guys right here under grow lights, and they're thriving there as well. I'd say direct to indirect sun is the way to go, and you can always supplement it with a grow light and it will thrive. As for variegation, like I mentioned before, it is really dependent on where the node grows. I know a lot of times people will say, hey, more sun increases the variegation, but I haven't found that to be completely true, at least for my experience. These cuttings have all been sitting under the same grow lights, and you can see that the variegation is very dependent on the plant and its genetics. I have found that if the plant is not getting enough sun, it will stop variegating even if it does have variegation on the stem and near the node. And that's because it needs the green leaves to produce energy, and if it's not getting enough sunlight, it won't get enough energy, so it will push out as many green leaves as possible to catch as much light as possible. I found the best way to get good variegation is to just keep propagating. Even if the cutting looks like it's not going to have variegation, eventually one of the nodes should land on whatever variegation is left. And through that node, it will just revitalize the variegation and bring it through to the leaves. However, that's not to say you should go out and buy the cheaper cuttings that are not variegated. It really just depends on the stem and not really the leaves. I've went ahead and taken care of these cuttings. I am just going to thoroughly water them, and then I want to show you the setup I have for them because these guys have not gotten a lick of sun since they've been propagated. This is the plant shelf that they live under. There are a lot of plants here, but I've just got a grow light on every shelf, and there's about a foot between each shelf, so they're pretty close to the grow light. And because they don't get the direct sun and the heat from the sun, I tend to water them a little less often than I would the ones that are in my window. The last important topic is how to support the plant, as they do climb up, and I find that they don't really need something to lean on, but more of just a guide, so I find that plant stakes are the perfect fit for these guys. Last but not least, temperature and humidity. For temperature, they like to be around 50 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit and around 50 to 60% humidity. With that being said, these plants are pretty flexible in both watering and lighting, but that is my care routine, and let me know if you have any questions down below.